So I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. Our speakers today will be Chelsea Zegler and Dr. Jamie Patton. They will continue their conversation from last year on how soil test phosphorus, STP for short, impacts water quality. You'll hear how different cover crops and soil health practices change water dynamics and learn more about the location and availability of phosphorus in different soil types. Chelsea Zegler is the Southern Wisconsin Outreach Specialist with our Agriculture Water Quality Program. Chelsea's outreach focuses on communicating the science of nutrient and soil losses associated with farming systems and providing tools for Wisconsin farmers, crop advisors, and conservation professionals to quantify and maximize the impact of different conservation practices. Dr. Jamie Patton is the State Soil Health Coordinator for Wisconsin Natural Resources Conservation Service. She earned her soil science degrees from Iowa State and Oklahoma State University. Chelsea and Jamie, the controls are yours.
All right, thank you, Amber, and thanks everyone for coming today. I really enjoy talking about phosphorus near Valentine's Day with Jamie every year. So appreciate you guys joining us. I come from a little bit of a soil health background, and that's why I'm so interested in how these soil health practices can impact nutrient cycling and how that affects not only our crop benefits, but also our water quality benefits and concerns. So first, here's the plan for today. We're gonna briefly do an overview of phosphorus and water quality in Wisconsin. Our whole hour webinar into a 5 minutes, so buckle up. We'll then hit soil phosphorus pools and their soil health impacts, how to assess initial phosphorus risk to water quality, and then move on to some on-farm management practices. So phosphorus and water quality in Wisconsin, as you likely know, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient in our aquatic systems, So when we add additional phosphorus, we start to see the ecosystems go a little berserk and not perform the ecosystem services that we need them to do. And I think recently in Extension, we have had new colleagues from out west, so from California and Idaho and Washington State, and that's really put in perspective how lucky we are to have these abundant natural resources in Wisconsin. Almost like immediately upon meeting them, their gut reaction is, oh, we treat water so differently in Wisconsin than we do in other parts of the US. So around 18% of Wisconsin's surface waters are impaired that are evaluated, and 50% of those impaired waters exceed their total phosphorus threshold. So that makes phosphorus Wisconsin's #1 pollutant. And non-point sources are much more difficult to control nutrient loss from too, right? So we've made a lot of progress on our point sources, and now we have 82% of that phosphorus coming from non-point source. So that means success hinges on agriculture in Wisconsin. All right, we're going to be talking about phosphorus a lot, so we thought we'd talk about some definitions first. And so we very rarely measure total phosphorus in the soil, right? We typically measure soil test phosphorus, which is an index of the phosphorus that we think is going to be available to the plant. But that's typically only a small portion of this total phosphorus. And within total phosphorus, we have organic phosphorus. So this might be what soil health is impacting, and that's phosphorus within soil organic matter, the microbial biomass, and within residue. And then we also have phosphorus that's bound to clay and mineral particles like aluminum and iron. And these are all both make up the particulate form of phosphorus. So that's typically phosphorus lost when we see soil or residue movement. And then secondly, we have dissolved phosphorus, which is phosphorus that can dissolve in the soil water. So that's typically how the plant takes up the phosphorus is in this soil water, but that also means it's vulnerable to water loss, surface water loss as well. All right, why phosphorus is such an issue in Wisconsin is because we brought in a lot of phosphorus. Through our rich agricultural history, we've imported things we need for our operations. So that could be fertilizer, feeds, bedding, or animals. So even if we're feeding our animals with crops from our acre, we're still typically bringing in a little bit of extra, either in, supplemental feed or minerals or imported bedding, things like that. And we typically, this input blue arrow is typically larger than our exports, what we remove from the farm, either as crop harvest or animal products. And because we have more inputs than exports, we start to build this legacy phosphorus pool. And that's why we talked about, when we're thinking about water quality, we can think about cover crops and reduce tillage, but we also, one important risk factor to look at is just how much phosphorus is in our soil to begin with, because as we build this pool, this loss arrow can get larger as well. And we typically lose our phosphorus in erosion, in runoff, or in leaching. And today we're going to focus in runoff. Okay, so just quick history, or not history, but quick background on how we lose phosphorus in Wisconsin, typically in two forms. This particulate phosphorus is what we've talked about and managed for in the past. This is soil erosion. And we typically lose that in late spring when we don't have crop canopy cover or residue or cover crop cover, but we have large thunderstorms and we might have prepped our fields for seeding. And what we started to talk about more is this dissolved reactive phosphorus, which typically happens on frozen ground in Wisconsin. And that's typically during snow melt. And it's more difficult to control. So we can have clear water leaving a field, but that doesn't mean there's no phosphorus in it. And it's also the same type of phosphorus we lose in tile drainage. And it is immediately available to our aquatic ecosystems, which makes it some more concern. So we haven't fully controlled particulate phosphorus loss or soil erosion, but at least we know how to, right? These are the conservation practices we've been cost sharing and working for a really long time. Dissolved reactive phosphorus is trickier, and that's why I wanted to focus on this today. So this would be the next step in managing for water quality once you already have erosion under control. Just some images to display that. On the right here, right, typical soil erosion caused by lack of cover in this field versus dissolved phosphorus loss is on frozen ground. This water can be clear, but that water is still interacting with fertility on the soil surface. And that, again, is really hard to control because a lot of our conservation practices have little impact when the ground is frozen, right? Water can't infiltrate. So we have to think about other management practices. All right, so now I'm going to take a sip of coffee and talk about soil phosphorus pools and soil health impacts. So I was just thinking about this in some different ways to think about the amount of phosphorus in our soil and how we access it and what's plant available. So there's a lot of phosphorus in our soil already, right? We have really rich, fertile soils due to the past prairies and forests that have been in Wisconsin land. So here's just an image of a soil profile, and this is all data from the Wisconsin Integrated Cropping System trial, which has been looking at different crop rotations for 30 years. And it might not be perfectly applicable to your system, but they do measure soil phosphorus very deep. So it provides a nice example here. So as you can see, they measured their soil test phosphorus in each in 1 foot increments in down to 3 feet in the soil. And then I used the soil test phosphorus value and the bulk density of the soil to get an available pounds of phosphorus per acre foot. So you can see, at the top here foot, we have 107 pounds. As next foot gets 83 pounds, and then this last foot actually gets quite a bit, 236 pounds of phosphorus. So that sums, almost over 400 pounds of potentially available P within that top 3 feet. And we think that this large value in the third foot of the soil is just due to 30 years of using shallow annual crops. We've seen kind of a buildup of phosphorus in this last, in this deeper foot. And like I mentioned, soil test phosphorus only represents 10% of the total phosphorus in the field. So Jamie will go over how 426 pounds of potentially available relates to how much a crop is removing. But that's still even smaller to the total phosphorus pool that we're looking at here. So in Wisconsin, phosphorus amount is not typically an issue. If we continue to break this down into shallower and shallower depths, you can see we start to get more fertility at the surface, which is natural within ag and non-ag systems. And you can see this 59 pounds of available phosphorus per acre. Typically 10% of that, again, is available as dissolved phosphorus. So that's about 6 pounds of phosphorus that's readily available to the plants, but also readily available to runoff, moving off of a field. All right, and then to put into some more context how this soil pool relates to our management practices and fertility regimes, winter fertility applications increase this risk. So Canada doesn't have a good liquid manure image, but bear with me for a solid manure image. But a typical liquid dairy manure application of 12,000 gallons per acre would supply around 21 pounds of phosphorus right at the soil surface, right? And almost 80% of it is available that first year. So even though it's a mix of inorganic and organic phosphorus sources, different than nitrogen, almost all of it is first year available. So if you're applying that on frozen ground, that means a large portion of it is at risk if there's no crop taking it up, or it's there's a long length of time before your next crop is needing the manure or actively uptaking the manure. Similar with synthetic fertility applications, a maintenance application for corn would be around 33 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And that's even a higher percent available or dissolvable in water upon application. So really thinking about that timing will be important for phosphorus loss. All right, Jamie, handing it over.
Perfect. Thank you, Chelsea. So luckily, I'm not able to share my video, so everybody is spared that experience. But when we think about soil health, that's what's really interesting when we think about soil health and how it impacts phosphorus cycling in the soil. We know in Wisconsin we have diverse practices. We're talking no-till, we're talking cover crops, low disturbance manure applications, so on and so forth. Each one of these practices are going to have different benefits, and most of you on this call have probably seen those benefits. We're seeing less erosion off the landscape. We're seeing better infiltration rates, better nutrient cycling, so on and so forth. But it's that better nutrient cycling that we're seeing that can cause us to rethink some of our practices. And not that they're bad practices, they're excellent practices. They are bringing benefits to the landscape. They're improving soil health. It's just that we need to reconsider potentially how we manage those to reduce our dissolved phosphorus risks on the landscape. Next slide, Chelsea. So when we think about these practices, please understand as I try and explain some of this phosphorus chemistry, one, this is my oversimplification of the process. So when you dive into the literature, because I know y'all do, and try and understand the chemistry, particularly the biochemistry of phosphorus in the soil, it's incredibly complex and there are no absolute answers, right? It all depends. So it isn't a cop-out in this instance. It really does depend upon those soil properties, on the climate that you're in, what kind of organic and inorganic sources are coming into your system, and maybe more importantly, how are you managing that system, including what crops are you growing and what cover crops are you growing and how much biomass are they accumulating. When we look at the diagram on the left, we'll see as we start to improve our soil health over time, what we can see is the movement of that phosphorus towards the soil surface, right? That is one of our goals, right? Is putting roots in that system all year round to stimulate biology, to stimulate aggregate formation. But as we do that, what we're doing is we're bringing phosphorus up from the lower subsoil and bringing it closer to the soil surface. For many of us in low phosphorus environments, that is a benefit, right? We're getting to be able to use that in our crop growth potential. But for those of us that have higher phosphorus, that movement of that phosphorus up into the soil profile may cause us some challenges when it comes to dissolved phosphorus. And we're going to talk about why that happens. Next slide, Chelsea. So in soil health management systems, please realize that when we look at the literature, it's fairly constant that we see that these soil health management systems, particularly when we integrate no-till and cover crops in a system and we get that biomass production on that cover crop, we're seeing less erosion. And with less erosion, we get less particulate phosphorus loss, and we're seeing overall lower total phosphorus losses. However, Chelsea, when we look at the dissolved phosphorus reactive phosphorus losses, excuse me, it's really hard to present when you're not controlling your own PowerPoint. So I apologize as I'm stuttering here. So when we look at how these systems impact dissolved reactive phosphorus losses, what we're seeing is the results are sometimes mixed, right? It depends upon the climate in the system, right? It's less of a problem potentially in warmer climates where we don't have frozen soils, where we don't have large snowfall amounts, and we're not seeing that large melt events. For those of us in the north, however, that can be a different story. And so when we see those increases in dissolved phosphorus reactive phosphorus losses, oftentimes it's due to this change in surface phosphorus concentrations under soil health management systems. It may have to do with hydraulic conductivity, particularly the biopore and hydraulic conductivity when we talk about leaching losses. And it has to do with those benefits that we see from the soil health management systems, that increased biomass, microbial biomass in cycling, as well as that change in soil absorption capacity. Next slide. So let's dive into what impacts soil health management systems have, particularly on dissolved reactive phosphorus at that soil surface. And so we're going to go through this diagram on the right. And the first section is on soil exploration. So the inclusion of conservation cropping systems, so those deep-rooted crops, those cover crops in our system, what we're doing and why we design these systems is to get a better exploration of that soil profile by that root system, not only for nutrient acquisition, but when we use those systems, we're trying oftentimes to break up compaction, improve infiltration, and stimulate biological activity. So they're doing what they need to do. As we get that improved root architecture, as we get that change in root morphology, as we get that increased exploration of the soil profile, what we're doing is we're solubilizing that phosphorus, we're bringing it closer to the soil surface, right? Either through plant biomass or through that root biomass. And we'll look here in a second as to how much phosphorus is actually in that biomass that is above ground as well as below ground. In addition, when we have those roots in the system, we're going to stimulate rhizosphere bacteria. So I always stumble on this one, right? Right, so those potentially the plant growth promoting rhizos bacteria, right? Man, I'm having troubles today. So plant growth promoting rhizobacteria, right? What those critters do is they release all sorts of hormones that help to not only release nutrients from the system, but also stimulate exploration of that soil by that root system. They're helping to control how that plant grows and adapts to its system. So that is a biological activity that helps with root exploration, as well as we're all very familiar with those mycorrhizal fungi, right? As we get that symbiotic relationship with those roots, we can increase the exploration of soil up to 700%, according to some research. And as those mycorrhizae are going out in the soil, they're solubilizing that phosphorus and moving it into the plant system. So all of this is bringing potentially phosphorus not only into that plant, but also towards the soil surface. Next slide. When we think about how those systems also impact mobilization, right? As plants grow, they're releasing hydroxides, they're releasing acids into the system, helping to solubilize that phosphorus, right? They're helping to change those cation exchange reactions. And what they're also doing is they're helping to chelate some of that phosphorus, keeping it into soil solution. So not only are those plants changing the chemistry, but their roots are out there exploring that soil to a greater extent. And next slide. As we're stimulating that microbial activity, those microbes are further releasing enzymes that are helping to break apart and make that organic phosphorus more soluble to themselves as well as to the plant system. So as you can see, it's quite complex, right? As we get those roots in the system, as we follow those 4 soil health principles and stimulate that biology and maintain those living roots, we're getting better exploration of the soil, we're mobilizing that phosphorus and making it more plant available, and we're stimulating those microbial activities to help to increase the solubility of that phosphorus as well. All of this has the potential to increase plant productivity and fertilizer use efficiency, nutrient use efficiency, but it can also contribute to the topic that we're talking about today, which is increases in dissolved reactive phosphorus. So those are all additions of phosphorus into the system. How do we take that phosphorus out of the system and store it so that it has less potential for loss? When we look at that phosphorus retention, it's basically in three forms, right? Immobilization, so the incorporation of that phosphorus into microbial biomass and storing in that organic form. It's precipitation, and we talked about this more, I believe, in the last webinar last year, when we see that phosphorus, that dissolved phosphorus react with calcium or iron or aluminum or other cations to create minerals, right? So they go from dissolved to solids, thereby reducing their potential for dissolved loss. But today what we're talking about is, and concentrating on, is going to be this adsorption reaction. So it's actually not a cation exchange reaction. It's not an electrostatic attraction of that phosphorus to the clay particles. So much like a magnet to a refrigerator, it's not that reaction. It actually becomes bonded through this reaction, this adsorption reaction. Next slide. And that's going to be an important concept when we talk about removing dissolved phosphorus from that soil solution and protecting it against runoff losses. So I know this is a kind of a complex diagram over here on the left, but what it's showing is when we look at this iron oxide mineral, right, what you're seeing is the replacement of the hydroxide. You'll see that phosphorus, you see the P with the 4 O's around it, so that phosphate ion. What you're seeing is that phosphorus becoming covalently bonded or becoming part of that mineral, right? This is an adsorption reaction. And why this occurs is because phosphorus is very chemically reactive in the soil. Iron oxides tend to be chemically reactive. And so due to differences in phosphorus concentration, pH, temperature, time, so on or so forth, we're going to see this phosphorus be adsorbed to these clay minerals. And when we do that, we remove it from the soil solution. This phosphorus can then slowly over time be released back into solution due to differentials in concentrations or through weathering reactions. So this is an important part. Next slide, please. When we think about how we manage phosphorus in our soils, this absorption reaction is a way to remove that dissolved phosphorus from solution. However, the literature is divided on this. How does improving soil health impact a soil's ability to absorb and kind of hold onto this phosphorus over time? So again, they haven't come to a consensus yet, but we see in some systems as we increase soil organic matter, and I'm looking at the top and the bottom of the diagram here on the left-hand side, what we can see is that organic can actually push that phosphorus off of that clay mineral. And when it does that, it goes from not being in the soil water, the phosphorus then gets pushed out back into the soil water and then is now more susceptible to loss. So this is one of those actions of soil organic matter to actually make phosphorus more susceptible to loss. Or there may be on the bottom of the diagram, you see there's simple competition. So those sites are going to be filled up with organic matter rather than phosphorus. And why this is important, what Chelsea will talk to us about, is as we get more and more dissolved phosphorus released into soil solution, we need the capacity in order to protect it from loss. And when we don't have the capacity for these sorption reactions, that dissolved phosphorus is going to stay in solution and the potential risk is greater. So when we think about soil health management systems in general, lots of benefits here. This is just something we need to think about as we develop our systems, is if we are on environments or on fields that have higher potential for dissolved phosphorus losses, we may need to tweak the system to reduce this potential for runoff loss. Chelsea.
Still muted. Thank you, Jamie. I make Jamie handle all the organic chemistry things that I wanted to forget about. We're going to pause here to launch a demographics poll. If you could all just take a moment or two to fill this out, it would be very grateful. It's necessary for us to continue to get funding to provide programs like this. So we'll just wait a few minutes as results come in.
As we allowed Chelsea and Jamie to take a nice deep breath before they encounter the second half of this presentation, we appreciate your help filling out this poll. And as a heads up, there's also a question as you leave the webinar that kind of asks you like what you learned and what you thought about today's webinar topic. That really helps us to improve our future programs. We want to make sure that these are valuable for you because they take time to put together. So if you could take just a moment to answer that when you leave as well, that is super helpful for us, and we appreciate your time today. Again, if you do have a question, I see we've got a couple already queued up in the Q&A. If you have accidentally hit the raise hand button, go ahead and send a chat in the chat box, and Kelsey or Sherry can help you with any needs that you might have. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of those raised hands. Looks like maybe the poll is about filled out, and I think Chelsea and Jamie, you can start back up.
Okay, and I did just update the chat settings, so you should be able to talk to one of the hosts or panelists if you need something.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So like I mentioned, you can see where we're going with this surface phosphorus level concern. And a lot of the research has been done across other states in the upper Midwest, you know, similar situations in Lake Erie and other Great Lakes states. But a lot of it might be limited to no-till versus no-till and cover crops. There's still a lot of questions on how these interactions work with different soil types, different lengths of time of practice adoption, things like that. So we're still trying to figure out some of those relationships. But at least initially here in Wisconsin, data from Discovery Farms has shown that your soil test phosphorus level in the top inch, which is down here, is related to the amount of dissolved phosphorus that you lose. So you can see as soil test phosphorus value goes up, you're more likely to lose dissolved phosphorus. And it's a pretty stronger relationship in surface than in tile. But you'll also see, we don't see significant increases until we're above this, 70 to 90 range and for soil test phosphorus, which is much higher than agronomic levels for soil test phosphorus. So, so there we go. So here's the levels for what it counts as excessively high for a loamy and a sandy soil, around 35 and 50. So we need to be that above 80 to have significant dissolved phosphorus risk. Okay. And why that is a lot of researchers have been referring to this zone of interaction, right? So if we have a soil profile and we're either saturated with water or we're frozen, we're getting a lot of chemistry happening in this top surface level. So it might not even be as big as 2 inches. It could be millimeters big. But as we see freeze-thaw cycles, as we see rainfall events, a lot of the water that's running off the field is interacting with this surface. So that's why we really want to focus on the soil surface. Okay, so in that way, an agronomic sample might be misleading, not on purpose. It still tells us the great benefits to crop fertility management. But if both these fields have an average soil test phosphorus of 30 parts per million, they might have a different risk based on different dissolved phosphorus loss risk, right? So this field A has a much higher concentration of phosphorus at the surface compared to this field B. It's not the only risk for water quality. It could be slope and landscape position, but this is certainly one thing we can look at to think about risk. So to try to address this issue of how high our surface concentrations in Wisconsin, as well as can we find soil health systems that let us maintain all the benefits and erosion control benefits, but also decrease or minimize the concentration of phosphorus at the surface, right? The gold standard would be being able to routinely apply surface phosphorus if it was needed without having it be in a high risk. So we started, the Ag Water program started this on-farm soil test phosphorus survey, and me and my colleagues had a really nice fall weather to go soil sample at all your farms. And we really want to thank the 59 farmers that agreed to work with us. So we sampled 157 fields in 24 counties across Wisconsin. We took a 0 to 2 inch soil sample. And the reason we did 0 to 2 inch was because that is what is recommended for no-till systems for that pH component. So we stuck with something that might have extra value. And then on all those fields, we also took field management history to look at crop rotation, tillage, what species of cover crops do you use, fertility placement, things like that. And we're still collecting this data. So fill out your surveys if you haven't. But today I'll just be talking about some initial results of what we've been seeing across Wisconsin. Okay, so first I'm going to put all these fields, into one of these 5 categories. So these are, hopefully you're familiar with this from A2809, our nutrient management guidance in Wisconsin. And I went ahead and I just used the level 1 demand for which would be most of our commodity grain crops. Okay, so here you'll see the percentage of fields in each category. And here's the 0 to 2 inch sample and the 0 to 6 inch sample. So we focus on this typical agronomic soil measurement. We had 61% of fields fall in this excessively high category, which surprised me a little bit with the higher fertilizer prices and potentially less livestock in the state. But it does take a really long time to draw down phosphorus, which I think Jamie's going to hit on. But that means that these fields have a less than 2% chance of yield response to additional phosphorus fertility. So one of the main things that these farms could do to impact water quality would be to go from this excessively high range to a lower category. And you would hopefully not see likely not see a impact on your crop yield. So it would hopefully have economic benefit as well too. Okay, if you remember, I talked about if the surface level is above 80 parts per million, that's when we're going to be the most concerned. So that would be the low-hanging fruit fields to worry about the most. So what I did was I made a new category of water quality concern. So this is above 80 parts per million. So it takes some of the fields that were in excessively high and puts them in water quality concern. And then here we're going to look at just the shallower sample, right? So we can see that just under 30% of samples of fields had a soil test phosphorus above 80. So this would be the fields we want to focus on first and foremost for water quality concern. And in general, the surface 0 to 2 inch did have higher soil test phosphorus than the 0 to 6 inch samples. That's not surprising. It happens in both tilled and untilled systems. That's not as much, the stratification is not as much concern rather than just the concentration at the surface is the concern. Okay, and just one last graph. I love graphs to help us visualize this. These are the same data points as before put on a scatter plot. So the 0 to 6 inch fertility level is down here. So for this point, we'll say somewhere around 140 agronomic soil test phosphorus and somewhere near 100 environmental soil test phosphorus range. And then this red line would be a 1-to-1 ratio so that they would have the same soil test phosphorus value. So again, you can see most of our points are above the line, which is okay and which is expected. But what we want to focus on is how we get all these points above 80, how we get them below the line. And we're hoping that the management practices can start to show us some nuance in terms of if we have an agronomic soil test phosphorus of 55, what's the management practices between this dot that has a surface level of above 100 versus these dots that have it lower? Are we seeing trends based on soil type or type of cover crop species, fertility placement, things like that? So those are some of the next steps. And then over to you, Jamie.
Perfect. Thank you, Chelsea. So when we think about this, we're seeing a little bit of concentration of phosphorus at the soil surface, but more importantly, what we're seeing, and we have those fields that have these high soil test phosphorus. So how do we manage these fields to reduce the potential for phosphorus loss, particularly dissolved phosphorus loss? So next slide. When we think about these field considerations, where, if I had to get the most bang for my buck, right, where would I concentrate my effort? Or in other words, where am I going to see increased runoff potential? As Chelsea pointed out, is for those fields that have surface soil test phosphorus above 80 part per million, particularly in that 0 to 2 inch range, where I surface apply nutrients. As Chelsea explained, those nutrients, whether they be manure nutrients or fertilizer nutrients, right, they are soluble. So as we get precipitation events, as we get runoff, there's the potential for that phosphorus to move off into our water bodies. We're going to look at those surface residues, and we'll talk more about those here in a second. So this is not only crop residue, but cover crop residue as well. And we know those fields where we have field conditions such as surface crusting, high rates of compaction are going to lead to increased runoff, but also that field topography. So those fields that are highly sloping, where I have greater potential for runoff losses, and those areas where I don't have non-stacked practices. And we'll talk about this. When I talk about conservation practices being stacked, I'm talking about not just having one, but having 2, 3, or 4 conservation practices in play, so that the synergistic effects of those practices help to not only increase soil health benefits, but reduce potential nutrient loss risks. When I manage this risk, and this is where we're going to talk about, right? Reducing that soil test phosphorus, managing nutrients, so on and so forth. So there's an individual slide on each one of those. So we'll start with that first one, reduce our soil test phosphorus. How do we do that? Well, we don't add more nutrients if we don't need them, but more importantly, we harvest something, right? And so this is where, when we think about how much phosphorus is actually being removed by a particular crop, we have those estimated P2O5 removals, or available phosphorus removals, down on the left-hand side per unit of yield. We know that our soils are highly buffered, so the pounds of P2O5 to change our soil test phosphorus by 1 part per million for most of us is around 18 pounds. So I need to remove 18 pounds of phosphorus in order to see my soil test phosphorus level reduced by 1 part per million. When we look at those individual crops, back Chelsea, when we look at those individual crops, how do I remove large amounts of phosphorus? Well, corn silage does a nice job, right? It's actually, much of that phosphorus is in the corn grain itself. You'll see, notice at a 200 bushel crop yield, we're removing about 74 pounds of phosphorus. That's about 4 part per million change. Silage, because we're taking the biomass, takes a little bit more, but in general, biomass, again, alfalfa up in those higher ranges as compared to soybean, where I'm only removing that phosphorus in the grain. But as you can imagine, if I start at an 80 part per million, bringing it down to that optimal range is going to take me a few years, right? And we need to be intentional about what crops I'm harvesting. I can increase this rate of removal. I can increase this rate of soil test phosphorus drop by potentially incorporating cover crops that I'm removing, right? And we'll talk more about that as well. So for those of you who are using the cereal rye corn silage forage system, there are potential there to be removing even more phosphorus from the system and reducing that potential runoff risk over time, because I'm removing not just one forage crop, but 2 forage crops over time. So it's being intentional about my crop rotations, not only from an agronomic and economic standpoint, but also thinking about this from a soil test phosphorus standpoint. Next. So if I'm removing that soil test, or lowering that soil test phosphorus through crop removal, that means I need to manage my nutrients as well, so that I am achieving the benefits of that crop removal of that phosphorus. So most of us, our source, we're not going to be able to change that, right? We have fertilizers, we have manures, we have compost, but what we can change and what we can manage are those rates. So if you Take me next, Chelsea. When we look at those rates, right, being that soil test, as Chelsea pointed out, she calls it an environmental soil test, right? That 0 to 2 range, figuring out what kind of phosphorus I have there. My fertilizer recommendations, however, are based on that 0 to 6 range or your tillage depth range. So making sure that I'm taking the appropriate soil tests, then I'm taking them on a scale that is appropriate, not only for my nutrient management plans, but to make my management decisions. So across the state of Wisconsin, in my opinion, right, this is my opinion, we don't use enough variable rate applications. So for some of us where we know that our phosphorus levels are quite variable across the field, there may be a benefit, economic as well as environmental, to doing a grid sampling approach and doing those variable rate applications to address only those areas where phosphorus is needed. Of course, I'm out here talking about manure testing and equipment calibration, right? Making sure that I'm applying what nutrient I think I am needing out there on the landscape and making sure that that calibration is appropriate. When I think about time, right? Chelsea talked about when applying those nutrients as close to in season or near season as possible. When we think about this is for any nutrient out there, when I apply it, I want the plant to take it up. That's the point of me applying it. So the closer I can get it applied to when the crop needs it, the less potential loss there is. So those in-season applications of phosphorus or near-season applications of phosphorus are going to be important. For those of us who manage manure, we have some potential there with those in-season applications. For those of us who are not using manure, oftentimes we're applying that phosphorus up front potentially banding it or surface applying it before that crop is growing. Also, when I think about time, I need to think about my risk management strategies about, are my soils below field capacity? So are my soils dry? If I do get a rainfall event, am I minimizing the chance for runoff? That's very important. And spacing those applications out away from those rain or irrigation events so that I have the potential for that nutrient to move into the soil and be utilized by the microbial biomass, be utilized by that crop growing crops so that it has less potential for loss. And where do I place that nutrient? When I place that nutrient, I want it in a place where it's going to be used. So when I'm strategizing manure applications, I'm going to go to my lowest testing fields. That's where that nutrient is needed anyway. That's where it should go. Fields with low risk. And what do I mean by that? Those are going to be if I'm worried about leaching losses, it's going to be a bit of my heavier textured soils, my less sloping fields, so on or so forth, so that I have less potential for erosion and runoff risk. But what Chelsea really wants me to talk about, right? And so you can smile and nod, right? Is that subsurface application. If we have the potential to get that nutrient below the soil surface, there's going to be less potential for runoff loss. So oftentimes this is a challenge in no-till systems, but we do have the technologies to do that. When we're looking at synthetic phosphorus, right? Banning of that phosphorus fertilizer can not only reduce the rate that we need to apply, but it also gets it below the soil surface so it has less potential for loss. When we think about manure applications for liquid manures in particular, right, we can look at injection. And I know many of you on this recording are probably very interested in low disturbance manure applications, right? How do I get into a no-till system and get that manure underneath the soil surface to protect it from loss, not only from nitrogen loss, but phosphorus loss? And we have the new technologies out there that help us do this. But when we get that nutrient below the soil surface, again, it doesn't interact with that runoff water. It doesn't solubilize that phosphorus, and that phosphorus doesn't move off into our water system. So when we think about managing dissolved phosphorus, you'll notice I concentrate heavily on those nutrient additions. I concentrate heavily on those soil test results. I also want us to think about crop residue. And so when we think about not only the crop residue, the cash crop residue, but that cover crop residue as well. So the research is showing that these freeze-thaw cycles, and it makes sense when we think about it, right? Freeze-thaw cycles disrupt those plant cells, right? So either the physical disruption of that cell by that ice, or as that ice forms, it starts to desiccate or draw water out of that cell, further causing that cell to break open and expel the phosphorus that's inside of that cell itself. So when we think about winter-killed cover crops, when we think about the crop residues that are laying on the soil surface, this process of freeze and thaw is going to release some of that phosphorus out into the environment. When we have snow melts, right, that water sits on the soil surface, it kind of stews with this phosphorus that has been released from these cells, and it makes it more susceptible to loss. Next. When we think about this, this is going to be different on non-frozen ground. So when we think about soil health management systems where I'm increasing my infiltration rates, increasing my aggregation at the soil surface, on non-frozen ground, right, when I get that precipitation moving through these broken cells, that phosphorus has the potential to move into the soil profile and be secured there. However, on frozen ground, this is where this huge issue, and I believe Discovery Farms, that slide wasn't included here, that much of our dissolved phosphorus is actually lost in the spring, right? After those freeze-thaw cycles have gone through, and as that snow melts, it picks up this phosphorus. So that frozen ground is really a challenge for us when trying to reduce those dissolved phosphorus losses. Next, so when we look at the research, and so this is what your real question is, right? What cover crops do I use to help reduce dissolved phosphorus losses, right? I'm not telling us, I am definitely not telling us not to use cover crops, right? It's about managing those cover crops appropriately if I think dissolved phosphorus is going to be a potential risk on my farm. And when we look at these concentrations, when we look at total phosphorus, the research tells us that brassicas contain more phosphorus than our grasses and legumes, and those living biomasses are going to contain 3 to 4 times more total phosphorus than that cash crop residue that's laying on the soil surface, right? This obviously is impacted by crop species, but also biomass accumulation. Makes sense, right? So the more biomass I have on the soil surface, the more total phosphorus I'm going to have. But Chelsea, what about that water extractable phosphorus? Go ahead. Keep going. What about that water extractable phosphorus? Next one. So we're going to see that of that total phosphorus that's in those cover crop residues, about 30 to 60% will be water extractable, meaning that it's going to be released as dissolved phosphorus. And it follows that same trends, brassicas over grasses over legumes. So when we think about how we're selecting our cover crops, right? I am advocating, and I will still advocate, that we're looking at mixes, right? Because we like that diversity out there on our landscape. But what we want to think about is this is release of phosphorus from winter-killed species, right? As well as looking at those species from concentration standpoint. So when I make those mixes, or when I'm selecting cover crops to reduce dissolved phosphorus losses, I'm going to want to have overwintering species, or at least a predominant overwintering species in my mix, right? Because those cells are not breaking apart when they freeze. They're going to hold onto that phosphorus over winter until I terminate that crop the next spring. And so I'm going to have less risk to dissolve phosphorus. If I am using something that winter kills, those overwintering species hopefully are going to be able to trap some of that phosphorus, particularly if on unfrozen ground where I have actively growing crops. So really important thoughts when we look at these cover crops. In addition, when we think about how we use these long term, some of the new research just published last year looking at comparing annual ryegrass, cereal rye, radishes, and oats. So those that overwinter, those that don't, right? The research found that annual ryegrass and cereal rye, those overwintering cover crops with those prolific and beautiful root systems at the soil surface, right, significantly decrease water extractable phosphorus in that top inch of soil. As Chelsea pointed out, this is the area of the soil that we're interested in. This is where a lot of that meltwater, a lot of that water is interacting with that soil and carrying that dissolved phosphorus on the landscape, right? So I think the research is starting to indicate to us, and is showing quite well, that when we select our cover crop species, we want them out there, right, to reduce total phosphorus losses, reduce erosion, to increase those soil health benefits, but we can be selective if dissolved phosphorus is our target, looking at those overwintering species, particularly looking at those grass and legume species more heavily in mixes, or to control and reduce these dissolved phosphorus losses. Next slide. In addition, again, I'm always preaching, and if you know me, I'm always preaching systems and stacking, right? So it's not just one practice. If we're truly dedicated to reducing dissolved phosphorus losses, I'm out there, I'm doing my soil testing, I am following the 4Rs, I'm managing my nutrients to reduce or maintain my soil test levels in that optimum range. I'm looking at reducing erosion across the landscape, reducing total phosphorus and particulate phosphorus losses through reduced tillage and through enhanced crop rotations. I'm utilizing those cover crops to the best of their ability, not only for soil health benefits and erosion control, but also utilizing those cover crops to retain that dissolved phosphorus over the growing season. That includes deciding when I terminate it in the spring to ensure that that phosphorus that's going to be released after termination can be used by that crop. And if I need really sloping fields, right? For those of you over in the driftless area, we need to be thinking potentially about even more enhanced practices, contouring and strip cropping to reduce erosion and runoff losses, or maybe even hard practice such as waterways, wascobs, water and sediment control basins, but really taking a comprehensive approach and thinking about my field, thinking about how it interacts with water, thinking about my field, how it interacts with phosphorus, and stacking those practices to put all sorts of insurance policies out there on the landscape to help reduce that dissolved phosphorus loss, right? So this isn't an overwhelming problem. This is just a problem that takes some thought, some planning, and some understanding of a little bit of the biochemistry that is going out there, the microbial activity that's going out there to help to reduce these losses over time. Next slide. So where do we concentrate? I already talked about that, right? Control those nutrient levels and choose your practices wisely. Chelsea.
All right, thanks, Jamie. Yep, so I think because we have 5 minutes left, maybe we'll skip to some questions. I'll also put the CCA credit QR code so you can scan this or put your numbers in the chat, and I'll let Amber facilitate questions.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie and Chelsea, for that awesome information. Really appreciate you guys continuing to dive into this topic. And I think we're just getting better and better on our ability to give more specific understandings of how this is all working. It is a complicated system. That first phosphorus cycle that you showed, that I felt seen because it is so complicated because it's really complicated. So thanks for sharing all that. Like Chelsea said, there is the QR code is up now for those of you that are looking for CCA credits. If you're wondering what CCA credits are, they are for certified crop advisors. So there's a system in place to go ahead and take a test and operate as a certified crop advisor in the state of Wisconsin and in other states. And so if that's something you're interested in, go ahead and check out their website. They have tons of information for you. And then you can get your continuing education credits by listening to awesome presentations like these. So yeah, so I am going to go ahead and start with the question that's gotten a lot of upvotes. And it is a nice lead into the fact that next in 2 weeks from now, we have our 4th webinar, which is about impacts of grazing systems on water quality. But I'm going to go ahead and give you guys the chance to answer Brooke's question. Is there any data on rate of reduction for P in grass systems, grazing or prairies?
I guess I'll go.
Perfect. You go first.
I was going to say, I know Discovery Farms does have data monitoring both. I'm not going to give an exact number. I guess I was just going to highlight, right, in pasture or perennial systems, you have less fallow ground and less disturbance. So you're less likely to have that particulate phosphorus loss. And you're also probably adding a less phosphorus to replace the biomass you're taking off. So I think your risk is lower there, but there certainly could be some timing concerns with winter grazing and things like that, or paddocks that are heavily grazed and have a lot of manure content. So luckily, Kelsey, my colleague, is going to highlight that more next week with some research from Eric Young at the Marshfield Ag Research Station. Anything to add, Jamie?
Perfect. No, I was going to say it depends, right? So that's the standard. So what kind of system are you looking at? So if this is a rotationally grazed system, we're going to probably see less phosphorus losses than a continuous graze system where I don't quite have the same kind of crop biomass out there where I have bare soil. I have potential for increased erosion and potential nutrient loss. It's also when I think about bale grazing, right? An excellent strategy to help improve soil health, but I really need to be conscious and think through where I put my bale grazing system, right? Because I'm going to concentrate manure at the soil surface, probably on frozen ground. So making sure it is located in an area where I'm not going to get runoff of that dissolved phosphorus. So this is a whole 50-minute seminar, right? And this is some fantastic questions, but there's a lot of considerations when we think about this. So as in every system, right? There's no absolute. We can't make these generalizations. It's very much a system specific kind of question.
Absolutely. Okay, one more here from Josh Camps. Good question about the PI in Wisconsin. Is the 0 to 2-inch soil test phosphorus value a part of a PI rating in Wisconsin fields?
Yeah, we are lucky to have Laura Ward-Good, who is the ultimate researcher on phosphorus loss, and who I called before this webinar. And it is my understanding that they use a model to estimate how much fertility is at the surface based on your 0 to 6-inch sample. So it is accounted for.
There's a couple questions about cover crop species here. I do think you did a really good job, Jamie, of covering those. Do you want to really quickly, like one word answer, what cover crop species can draw down soil test P the fastest?
Grass, harvest it. Can I say
Grass.
3? Harvest it, grass.
Perfect. Best cover crop to break up soil compaction.
Grass.
Jamie loves grass. All
I
right.
love grass.
And then, oh man, there's a lot of good questions. I do want to be respectful of time. We are at 1 o'clock. So we're going to go ahead and catalog these questions. If you want to reach out to the speakers to ask them your question specifically, if we didn't get to it, their contact information is there on the slide. We really appreciate you spending time with us and asking these awesome questions. We invite you to go to the Ag Water Quality Program website for articles that have similar content. The recordings for all of these webinars in the series and last year's series are uploaded to YouTube and linked in the Ag Water Quality Program website. And we would love to have you join us in 2 weeks on February 27th to talk about grazing's impact on water quality. You can also reach out to us anytime, and we appreciate your engagement in this. You can find contact information on our website if you need to get a hold of us, and make sure you watch for that exit survey question on your way out. So thank you so much. Appreciate you. Have a good day. Kelsey or Sherry, can you copy and paste those questions?